You train for everything, or you think you do. They march you until your feet bleed. They teach you to strip a rifle blindfolded to dig a hole that'll save your life. But they never train you for the thirst. It's a different kind of animal, that thirst. It starts as a nagging in the back of your throat, a dryness, but after a day on the march, with the dust of Russia or the mud of France caking your face, it becomes something else. Your tongue feels like a piece of old leather, swollen and useless. Your throat. Your throat feels like you've swallowed sandpaper, every breath scraping raw. You give anything for a drop of water, and I mean anything. In that moment, a full canteen isn't just a piece of equipment, it's a treasure chest. It's life itself sloshing against your hip. And an empty canteen, that's a death sentence you can feel, a hollow weight that's heavier than any stone. You learn to judge a man's spirit by the sound his canteen makes. A good, hearty slosh and he's still in the fight. A faint, pathetic trickle, and you see the fear in his eyes. We got creative, you have to understand. When the supply lines were cut, when the wells were poisoned or the streams were choked with things you don't want to think about, you found a way. We'd pour water through a sock filled with coffee grounds, the bitter taste a small price to pay for not shitting yourself to death. I saw men, good men, reduced to animals, risking sniper fire to scoop water from a muddy puddle, knowing it might be the last thing they ever drank. That's the choice you make, a quick death from a bullet or a slow, agonizing one from dysentery. You learn the value of things real quick out there. A canteen of clean water was worth more than any medal, more than a general's praise. It was tomorrow. And there were rituals, unspoken rules that were more sacred than any military protocol. You never, ever drank the last sip without offering it around. It was a small thing, a gesture, but in that hell it was everything. Anyone, you'd croak, holding up the canteen, feeling its terrifying lightness. Sometimes a buddy would nod, just a dampening of the lips, a shared moment of humanity. Sharing a canteen was like sharing blood. It created a bond stronger than any oath of allegiance to a flag or a fura far away. It was a promise between you and the man next to you. I will keep you alive today. The sound of water in a canteen became the soundtrack of survival. On a forced march, when your pack felt like it was filled with lead and your lungs were on fire, that rhythmic slosh against your thigh was a lullaby, a promise that you could make it another kilometer, another hour. But when it went silent, when you couldn't hear that little splash anymore, that's when the real terror set in. The silence was louder than any artillery barrage. It was the sound of the end creeping up on you. You'd shake the canteen just to hear something, anything, but that hollow rattle was worse than silence. It was a verdict. But a canteen was more than just for water. That simple piece of stamped aluminum became our kitchen, our pharmacy, our clock. You'd unscrew the cup, that shallow metal bowl, and over a tiny, hidden flame, a precious bit of fuel or a few sticks of damp, you'd heat up a miserable broth from a cube. It was mostly hot water and salt, but in the freezing cold of a Russian winter, cupping your hands around that warmth, smelling that steam, it felt like a feast. It was a moment where you weren't a soldier, you were just a man, having a hot meal. I remember once my friend Klaus, he took a piece of shrapnel in the leg during a retreat. No morphine, no proper bandages, just the freezing cold and his fever starting to burn him up. All I had was my canteen, half full with icy water. I pressed the cold metal against his forehead, and the relief in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just closed his eyes, and for a second he wasn't in that hell. He was somewhere else, somewhere cool and quiet. That canteen gave him that. And always, always, there was the physical reminder of it. The hollow thud it made against your hip bone with every step, a constant, rhythmic tap-tap-tap. It wasn't just an annoyance, it was a reminder that you were fragile, that you needed this simple thing to live, and that you had to keep going, keep filling it, keep it safe, or that tapping would stop forever. The weight of that thing, it wasn't just the water. It was the memories it carried. I'll never forget young Hans. He couldn't have been more than 18, fresh off the train, still with that farm boy look in his eyes. We got caught in a nasty bit of crossfire near a village whose name I've blessedly forgotten. He took a bad hit, stomach wound. There's nothing you can do for that. Nothing. He was lying there, pale as a ghost, and he kept whispering, "Wasser, bit, wasser. Please, water." We all knew the rule, the old soldier's rule. You don't give water to a gut-shot man. It only speeds things up, makes it more agonizing. Looking into his eyes, Seeing the child he still was, I couldn't bear it. Another soldier, a veteran named Erich, looked at me, and without a word he unscrewed his own canteen. It was his last one. He didn't have much himself. He knelt down, lifted Hans's head gently, and let him take a few small sips. The gratitude on that boy's face. He died maybe 10 minutes later, but he died with a taste of something clean in his mouth, not just blood and dirt. Erich never said a word about it. But I saw him later, shaking his empty canteen with a look on his face that's haunted me for 50 years. It wasn't anger, it wasn't regret. It was just a profound, bottomless weariness. That was the weight a canteen could carry, the weight of a man's last drink. Another time, after a particularly brutal assault, we were moving through a field littered with the aftermath. I saw a canteen lying next to a fallen soldier, a guy from another unit. It was just lying there, half buried in the mud. And you're faced with a decision. Your own is near empty. You need water to survive. But taking that canteen, it feels like grave robbing. It feels like stealing from a dead man. I stood there for a full minute just staring at it. Do I take it? Is it disrespectful? Is it necessary? In the end, survival wins. You do what you have to do. I picked it up. It was cold and muddy. I wiped it clean on my trousers, and the weight of it in my hand felt wrong, like I was carrying a piece of that man's soul. I drank from it eventually, but the water tasted of guilt. You never forget a thing like that. It's those small moments of degradation that stick with you, not the big battles. My own canteen, the one I started with, it became my most personal relic from the whole damn war. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a flag. It was this dented, scratched-up piece of metal that had been with me through everything. Every dent told a story. This big one here, that was from a fall during a retreat near Stalingrad, when I slipped on the ice and thought for sure the Ivans had me. This long scratch, that was from shrapnel that whizzed past my hip, a few inches to the right, and it would have been me instead of the canteen. The strap was frayed, replaced once with a piece of string from a grain sack. I knew every curve of it, every scratch. It was like a diary of survival, written in aluminum and grime. When you've lost everything else, your friends, your innocence, your belief in what you're fighting for, you cling to the physical things that kept you alive. That canteen was my proof that I had made it through another day. I'd hold it at night, and its solidity, its reality, was a comfort. It was something I could control. I could fill it. I could drink from it. I could keep it safe. In a world of chaos, that meant everything. You see, they never tell you about the small things. In the history books, it's all about the generals and the movements of armies. But for us, the men in the mud, the war was fought over a cup of water, over a shared cigarette, over a moment of kindness in an ocean of cruelty. It was in the sound of a canteen sloshing on your hip, a sound that said, "You are still alive. For now, you are still alive." And when you heard that sound go silent in the man next to you, you knew a little piece of the world had gone dark. You learned not to ask his name, because names made it hurt too much when the silence came. You just listened to the water, and you prayed yours would never run dry. This canteen here, I still have it. My grandchildren don't understand why I keep this old, beat-up thing. They look at the dents and the scratches and they see junk. But I look at it and I see faces. I see Klaus's feverish forehead. I see Erich's sacrifice. I see young Hans's last moment of peace. I see 1,000 miles of marching, 1,000 nights of fear. I see the weight of what it took to come home. It's just a canteen, but it's the heaviest thing I own. You learn things out here they don't teach you in basic training. They can drill the manual of arms into you until you can field strip a carabiner in your sleep, but they can't teach you how to listen to the sky. That's a language you pick up quick, or you don't pick up anything ever again. The first few weeks, every whistle was the same. A high, terrifying scream that sent you scrambling, heart hammering against your ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. But after a while, your ears get educated. You learn the difference. There's the one that starts high and just stays high, a tearing sound that goes right over your head and lands somewhere behind you, and you let out a breath you didn't know you were holding. And then there's the other one. The one that starts high and then the pitch drops, gets deeper, like the thing is tipping over, aiming right for you. That's the one that turns your guts to water. That's the one you dive for the nearest hole for. You don't need an officer to tell you. The air itself tells you everything. And the veterans, the old hands who'd been in it since Poland or France, their faces were like books if you knew how to read them. Man who's seen too much, His eyes get a certain look, a 1,000-yard stare they call it now, but then it was just the look. He wouldn't say a word, but if you saw him suddenly go still, his head cocked just so, and that flat, empty look in his eyes sharpened into focus, you knew. You knew to get down, to shut up, to make yourself small. It was the same with sound. You learned the crunch of gravel under a boot, not just any crunch, but the specific, authoritative tread of an officer making his rounds. You'd be huddled in a dugout, maybe sharing a damp cigarette, talking in low voices about home, about girls, about anything but the war, and you'd hear it. A certain firm, deliberate step on the stones outside. The conversation would die instantly. Shoulders would straighten, faces would wipe clean of any emotion. We'd become soldiers again, not just scared boys. It was an unspoken signal, a shift in the atmosphere as tangible as a change in the weather. These were the unwritten rules, the grammar of survival on the front. It was about reading the signs, listening to the silence between the explosions. You lived by a new kind of etiquette, a desperate politeness born from the need to not die. Take something as simple as a cigarette. Back home, you'd light one without a thought. Out here, lighting a cigarette in the open after dark was like painting a target on your forehead. Some Russian sniper a few 100 meters away, watching for that tiny, glowing dot. So we had a ritual. In the dugout, if we were lucky enough to have a match, one man would cup his hands around the flame, his body forming a shield, and we'd all lean in, one after the other, touching the tip of our cigarette to his, a brief, warm glow illuminating the grimy, tired faces for just a second. It was a small thing, but it was a moment of communion. The shared light, the shared risk. It was a way of saying, we're in this together. There were other superstitions, little charms against fate. You never wanted to be the last man to finish your meal, for instance. It was a silly thing, but it stuck. The idea was, if you were always the last one, then one day you'd be the last one to do something else, the last one out of a trench, the last one across a field. It was a jinx. So even if the food was terrible, the same bland Erbswurst stew or rock-hard bread, you hurry to finish it, to not be that guy. You moved differently out there, too. You learned a new way to walk. Running was for emergencies. Running meant panic, and panic drew attention, both from our own officers and from the enemy. So you developed a sort of shuffle, a low, quick, purposeful movement along the trench, keeping your head down, your body coiled. It wasn't about speed, it was about being inconspicuous, a part of the landscape. You wanted to be a shadow, a whisper, not a shout. And the silence, God, the silence could be worse than the noise. There's a particular kind of quiet that falls over the line before an attack. It's not peaceful. It's heavy, thick, pregnant with everything that's about to happen. The normal background chatter stops. The random mortar fire ceases. Even the wind seems to die down. You can hear your own heart beating in your ears. That silence was more frightening than any barrage because you knew what it meant. It meant the Russians were gathering, moving up. The officers were checking their watches. It meant the storm was coming, and all you could do was wait in that awful, suffocating quiet, your hands gripping your rifle so tight your knuckles turned white, every nerve stretched tight as a wire. You even learned to sleep differently. A deep, restful sleep was a luxury you couldn't afford. You slept in short, alert bursts. Your body tuned itself to the soundtrack of the night. The normal sounds, rustle of a rat in the parapet, the distant hoot of an Althes were your lullabies. But any new sound, a change in the pattern, and you were instantly awake, eyes wide, heart racing, hand reaching for your weapon. A snapped twig, a muttered word in a language you didn't understand, the faint clink of metal on metal. Your senses became your sentries. During patrols, talking was suicide. We spoke with our hands. A raised, closed fist meant stop. A pointed finger meant look there. A slow, downward motion meant get down. A whole conversation could happen without a single sound. Your life depended on the man next to you understanding what a slight tilt of your head meant. That kind of thing forges a bond you can't explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It's more than friendship. It's a physical understanding, a shared nervous system. But there were rules, deeper rules, that you never, ever talked about. The kind of fears you couldn't give a voice to. You didn't say, I'm terrified of being buried alive in a collapsed dugout. You didn't whisper, I have nightmares about burning alive in a tank. To say it out loud was to invite it, to make it real. So we choked those fears down, swallowed them like bitter pills, and talked about the weather or the food or a pretty girl we'd seen in a village 2 years ago. We built a wall of small talk to keep the big terrors out. And then there was the strangest rule of all, the one that felt almost like a betrayal of the whole damn war. You developed, an understanding with the enemy. Not officially, of course, but in the quiet sectors when the lines were close, you'd hear them just like they could hear us. They'd be singing sometimes, a sad, mournful song that carried across the frozen mud. You could smell their cooking smoke, a different smell than ours. And after a while, you stopped thinking of them as the fanatical subhumans the propaganda posters showed. They were just men like us, stuck in this hell. There was this one time, it was early morning, a thick fog lying over no man's land. I was on watch, and I saw a figure emerging from the mist. A Russian soldier, no more than 50 meters away. He saw me at the same time. We both froze, rifles half raised. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. He was just a kid like me, with a thin, pale face under his Ushanka, and in that moment there was an unspoken agreement. Neither of us fired. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and melted back into the fog. I did the same. Why? Because we both knew. We both knew that if we started shooting, it would bring down a world of hurt on both our positions. Mortars, machine guns, all for one single soldier. It was simpler, easier, and more human to just let it be, to avoid unnecessary suffering. It was a truce between two men, a rebellion against the madness around us. These rules, they weren't written in any manual. They were etched into you, carved into your bones by fear and exhaustion. They became a second nature, a sixth sense. Long after the guns fell silent, long after I traded my uniform for civilian clothes, I still had them. For years, I'd wake up bolt upright in my warm, safe bed at the slightest unusual sound. I'd catch myself analyzing the whistle of a train, my body tensing out of habit. I'd see a group of men laughing, and I'd look for the officer's boot steps. That's the thing they never tell you. The war doesn't end when the surrender is signed. It ends when the last man who fought it dies. And even then, I wonder. I still don't like to be the last one to finish a meal. It's a stupid superstition, I know. But out there, superstitions were all we had. They were the little rituals that made us feel like we had some control over the chaos. We were just boys, most of us. We didn't care about ideology or Lebensraum. We cared about the man next to us. We cared about the next hot meal. We cared about staying alive one more day, one more hour. You learn to find humor in the darkest places, a grim, gallows humor that would shock anyone back home. Like when Fritz, my old squad mate, got a package from his mother with a pair of brand new, beautifully knitted socks. He was so proud of them. The next day, a mortar blast covered him in mud from head to toe, ruining them. He didn't curse or cry. He just looked down at his ruined socks, covered in stinking wet earth, and said, "Well, Mother will be pleased to know they're properly broken in." And we all laughed, a raw, barking laugh, because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry, and if you started crying, you might never stop. The homesickness was a physical pain, a constant ache in your chest. You'd lie in your foxhole, the rain dripping through the roof of your makeshift shelter, and you'd think of your mother's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread. You'd think of a girl you'd danced with once, the feel of her hand in yours. You'd close your eyes and try to remember the sun on your face without the accompaniment of gunfire. Those memories were like precious, fragile things you carried with you, taking them out to look at in the quiet moments, polishing them with your mind until they shone. But you had to be careful with those memories, too. They could soften you, make you want to live too much, and wanting to live too much could get you killed. You had to find a balance between remembering why you were fighting to survive and forgetting the world you were fighting to get back to, because that world seemed a million miles away from the mud and the blood and the constant, grinding fear. And that's why I never learned the new guys' names. The replacements. They'd come up the line, fresh-faced, clean uniforms, their eyes still bright with the nonsense they'd been fed back at the depot. They looked like we did, a year ago, 2 years ago. And you'd see them and you'd know. You'd know that half of them wouldn't last the month, some wouldn't last the week. They hadn't learned the language yet. They didn't know the whistle from the scream. They stood up too straight. So you'd nod to them, you'd show them the ropes, you'd share your food with them, but you wouldn't ask their name. You wouldn't tell them yours. Because if you did, if you let yourself see them as a person with a name, with a mother and a sweetheart waiting for him back in Hamburg or Dresden, then it would wreck you when he was gone. When a shell fragment tore him in half, or a sniper's bullet found him while he was peering over the parapet. It was a rule, the hardest rule of all. You couldn't afford to mourn every loss. There were too many, so you built a wall. You let them stay a face, a body, a replacement. It was cruel, maybe, but it was necessary. It was the only way to keep your own heart from shattering into 1,000 pieces. You focused on the men who were left, the old hands, the ones who knew the rules. We were a brotherhood of the damned, bound together by the unspoken language of survival. And when one of us did buy it, we didn't talk about it. We just divided up his rations, took his spare ammunition, and moved on. It sounds cold, I know, but that was the ultimate etiquette of the front, the rule of silence. The silence that shielded you not from the enemy's bullets, but from your own humanity, which had become a luxury you could no longer afford. That silence stayed with me, too. Long after the war, at family gatherings, everyone laughing and talking, I'd sometimes just go quiet. They'd ask what I was thinking about. I'd just smile and say, nothing. How could I explain? How could I tell them that I was listening for the sound of a boot on gravel, or the specific whistle of a shell, or the profound, terrifying quiet before the storm? How could I explain that a part of me was still there, in the mud, with the men whose names I never knew, living by the rules that kept us alive, the unwritten rules of silence? You ask about the letters. You see the photos, the neat handwriting on thin paper, and you think you know. You think it's all there. But the real story of the mail, the post that came and went, that's not in the words that were sent. It's in the ones that weren't. For me, it's all in a single letter I carried in the breast pocket of my tunic for months, right over my heart, until the paper was soft as cloth and the pencil smudged almost to nothing. I never sent it. To send it would have been a kind of violence, a cruelty I couldn't bear to inflict on her. My mother. You see, we lived two lives back then. There was the life we wrote home about, this strange, sanitized adventure, and then there was the life we actually lived, knee-deep in Ukrainian mud, the air thick with the smell of cordite and decay. And the bridge between those two lives was built out of paper, and it was a very fragile, very dangerous bridge indeed. Let me tell you about writing the official version, the one that actually went in the envelope. You get a quiet moment. If you were lucky, maybe crouched in a dugout with a stump for a table, the kerosene lamp flickering and throwing huge, dancing shadows on the earth walls. You'd smooth out the feldpost paper, that rough, greyish paper that was somehow both coarse and terribly fragile, and you'd begin, "My dearest parents, I am well. I hope this letter finds you in good health." It always started the same way, a ritual of lies. You had to find things to say, so you described the food. The watery potato soup, with a few gristly bits of meat that we called Old Man or Iron Ration, you transform into a good, hot meal that really hit the spot. The frozen, lice-infested dugout that we shared with rats became adequate shelter from the elements. We were masters of translation, you see. We took the language of misery and turned it into the language of reassurance. The constant thunder of the Katyushas, Stalin's organs, we called them that terrifying, screaming whistle that shredded your nerves, became, the artillery is active, but we are safe in our positions. You learned to censor yourself long before any officer ever saw the letter. You never mention a location, of course, not even the country. Russia was the east, France was the west. It was all a vast, anonymous landscape of duty. The hardest part was writing to a sweetheart or your mother. You had to be the man they imagined you to be. Brave, steadfast, maybe even a little heroic. You puff out your chest on paper, trying to sound like the stoic soldier in the propaganda films, when inside you felt about as brave as a startled rabbit. You were just a boy, really, a boy who missed his home and his mother's cooking and the sound of real silence, and you were desperately trying to sound like a man who belonged in this nightmare. I remember once writing to my mother about how we'd managed to brew some real coffee from a parcel she'd sent, how wonderful it smelled. What I didn't write was that we brewed it in a cleaned-out petrol can, and that while we drank it, we were taking sporadic mortar fire, and the smell of the coffee mixed with the smell of burnt explosives and the earthy scent of fear sweat on my uniform. But then there were the other letters, the ones for the bottom of the pack or the inside pocket, the unsent truths. We all wrote them, I think, on scraps of paper, the back of a map, anything you could find. That's where you could be honest. That's where the real you, the frightened boy, could pour his heart out. I had one such letter my mutter briefed me mother letter. I started it after a particularly bad day near a place I won't name, a river crossing that went wrong. I saw a young Russian soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, cut down by one of our MG-34s. He just fell apart. It was quick, I suppose, but the image wouldn't leave me. He had a look of pure surprise on his face, like he'd just been told a joke he didn't understand. And he had a photo, a small, curled snapshot, clutched in his hand. It fluttered to the mud when he fell. I didn't pick it up, but I saw it from a few meters away. A girl, dark-haired, smiling. And that night, in a foxhole with rain dripping through the overhead cover, I took out a pencil and a scrap of paper, and I started to write to my mother. "My dearest Muddy," I wrote, "today I saw a boy die, and I cannot get his face out of my head. He looked so young, Muddy, younger than me. He had a girl's picture in his hand. Did he write to her? Did he tell her he was well, that the food was adequate, that he was brave? Does she now stare at a map of this God-forsaken country, wondering where he is, while his body sinks into the mud?" I wrote about the shameful things, the thoughts you could never voice. I wrote, "Sometimes, Muddy, the fear is so thick I can taste it, like copper pennies on my tongue. When the bombardment starts, my whole body shakes so hard I think my bones will come loose. I want to run. I want to dig a hole so deep that no sound can reach me and just hide until it's all over. I'm not the hero you think I am. I'm just terribly, terribly scared. But you could never send that. To send that would be to transfer that fear, that horror to her. It would be like handing her a burning piece of shrapnel and saying, 'Here, hold this for me.' So the letter stayed with me, a secret confession. The letters we received, though, they were a different kind of burden. A letter from home was like a shot of good schnapps. It could warm you from the inside for a whole day. The feel of the envelope, the familiar handwriting, you'd save it, sometimes for hours, just savoring the anticipation. Then you'd find a quiet corner and devour it. My mother would write about the most mundane things, how Frau Schmidt's cat had kittens, how the apple tree in the garden was heavy with fruit, how she'd managed to barter for a real egg at the market. And for those few minutes, you weren't in Russia. You were there, smelling the apple blossoms, hearing the cobblestones underfoot. But then you definish the letter, and the reality would come crashing back, grey sky. The smell of wet wool and damp earth, and the words from home would feel like they were from another planet, a life so distant it might as well have been a dream. That distance could be agony. It was a reminder of everything you were missing, everything that was slowly, inevitably, changing without you. Then there were the other letters, the ones that broke you. We called them brief mit dem Dolchletters with a dagger. The Dear John letters. I saw it happen to Klaus, a buddy of mine from Hamburg. He was a big, sturdy fellow, a locksmith before the war, with hands like hams and a laugh that could shake the dirt from the rafters. He got a letter from his girlfriend, Liesel. He opened it with a big grin, and we all watched as the color drained from his face. He didn't say a word. He just folded the letter neatly, put it back in the envelope, and walked away from the bunker. He stood outside in the drizzling rain for a long time, just staring at nothing. When he came back, his eyes were red, but he was dried. Someone made a joke, asked him what Liesel had to say. He just shrugged and said, "She found a civilian who isn't up to his knees in shit." And that was it. He never spoke of it again. But you could see the light had gone out in him. He became quieter, more reckless. The letter had killed something in him as surely as a bullet. And there was another kind of guilt, a strange, twisting feeling you get reading about the hardships at Homuth bombing raids, the food shortages, the constant fear. My mother would try to brush it off, but you could read between the lines. And you'd feel so helpless, so guilty, lying in your hole in the ground because you were supposed to be protecting them, but you were thousands of kilometers away, useless, while they suffered. All of it, the cheerful lies we sent, the painful truths we kept, the bittersweet news we received, it all built into a weight of the unsaid. That letter to my mother, the unsent one, became the physical embodiment of that weight. I carried it in my left breast pocket. It was my secret companion. In a way, it was a comfort. It was the only thing that knew the real me. Sometimes, during a lull, I'd take it out and just hold it, feeling the soft paper, knowing that my true self was recorded there, even if no one would ever read it. It was a dangerous comfort, of course. If I were captured and it was found, it would show despair, weakness. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It felt like destroying the only honest part of me left. That changed before a big push we knew was coming. The rumor mill was churning, the officers were tense. and the air itself felt thick with impending violence. We were ordered to lighten our packs, to carry only the essentials. And I knew I couldn't go into that with the letter on me. I didn't want some stranger finding it on my body, reading my fear, and then having that letter, my most private confession, sent home to my mother. That would be the ultimate betrayal. So that night, I made a small fire at the edge of our position, a tiny, furtive flame. One by one, I took out the scraps of paper draft about the Russian boy, the confession of my cowardice. All of it, and I fed them to the fire. The paper curled and blackened, the pencil lines glowed for a second, and then vanished into ash. It felt like a funeral. I was burying the boy I had been, the one who was still honest enough to admit he was scared. The man who was left, the one who would go into the attack the next morning, was the one from the letters I sent home. Numb, dutiful, empty of anything that couldn't help him survive. And that, in the end, was the deepest wound of all, deeper than any shrapnel scar. It was the chasm that grew between the soldier I pretended to be in my letters and the hollowed-out man I had become in the mud. The war didn't just kill men. It killed the people we used to be long before our bodies ever stopped. And that letter I carried but never sent. That was the first casualty. The funny thing they don't tell you is how loud it all is, all the time. It's not like in the pictures where you hear a bang and then some talking. It's just noise. A constant, roaring, screaming hell of sound that gets inside your skull and rattles around until you can't think straight. The shells coming in, the crump, crump, crump of the mortars, the ripping cloth sound of the MG-42s, our own guns answering back, men yelling, men screaming, that awful gut-wrenching kind of screaming that doesn't even sound human anymore. And in the middle of all that, you're supposed to be the calm one. You're the medic. You've got the red cross on your arm, and somehow that's supposed to be a shield, but it feels more like a target sometimes. They'd set up the casualty collection point in a ruined farmhouse cellar, what was left of it anyway. The air was thick with dust, and the sweet, coppery smell of blood, and the sharper stink of cordite and damp earth. It was chaos, just absolute bedlam, wounded guys laid out on the floor, some quiet, some begging for their mothers, the orderlies trying to sort them all out. And my sergeant, old Doc Haggerty, he just grabbed me by the shoulder, his face grim under the grime, and he pointed to a spot near the stairwell. 3 new ones just came in from the line, kid, you're up. And just like that, it was on me. I walked over, my boots sticking to the floor, God knows what from, and I saw them, 3 guys. One was just a kid, couldn't have been more than 18, breathing in these quick, shallow gasps, his face white as a sheet, clutching his stomach, the dark stain spreading slowly across his OD shirt. Another was an older guy, a sergeant maybe. He had a leg that was just a mess, bones sticking through his pants, and he was cursing a blue streak, his voice hoarse with pain and rage. The third one was quiet, too quiet, propped against the wall, just staring off into space with a kind of confused look on his face, a small, neat hole in his chest. And you have to do it. You have to make the calculation. It hits you in a second, a cold, horrible clarity that cuts right through the noise. The kid with the gut wound, that's bad. Real bad. He might last an hour, he might last a day, but the chances are slim and he'll take up time and morphine we don't have to spare. The sergeant with the leg, he's in agony, but a tourniquet high and tight, and he's got a fighting chance, he's a save. The quiet one with the chest wound, that's the sucking chest wound, the one you dread. If that lung is collapsed, he's drowning in his own blood. He's priority. It's a terrible thing to look at 3 boys, 3 lives, and in a split second decide their fates like your God Almighty. You feel sick doing it, but you don't have time to be sick. So I went to the quiet one. I dropped to my knees, my medkit thumping on the ground, and I talked to him, my voice sounding strange and thin against the roar outside. Hey there, soldier, I'm here. You're gonna be all right. Lies, all lies, but you say them anyway. I opened his tunic, my hands fumbling with the buttons, and the wool was already sticky, warm and wet against my fingers. The smell of fresh blood is like nothing else. It's a warm, metallic smell that fills your nose and your mouth. I had to find the wound, the exit wound, my hands patting his back, feeling for the tear in the fabric, all while he just kept staring, his eyes wide, his breath coming in little wet gurgles. That was the first triage. That was the moment the boy I was back in Indiana, the one who worried about batting averages, and whether Mary Ann Perkins would say yes to the pictures, just packed up and left. Someone else had to take over, someone with steady hands. And your hands, they learn. After a while, they just know what to do. Your mind can be screaming, your heart pounding so hard you think it'll jump right out of your chest, especially when the shelling gets close and the whole world shakes and dirt rains down on you. But your hands, they just work. They tear open the wax paper packet of the sulfur powder. They fold the bandage. They tie the tourniquet, the granny knot followed by the square knot, tight, tighter, until the bleeding stops. You learn the feel of a man's pulse under your grimy fingers, the difference between a bad wound and a mortal one just by the look of it, the temperature of the skin. You give a shot of morphine, the little syringe like a tiny toothpaste tube. You bend the wire to break the seal, prick the needle through the uniform and squeeze. You'd scribble a big M on his forehead with a grease pencil so the next guy down the line would know he'd had it. It was all routine, a brutal, bloody routine. But it wasn't just the mechanics, it was the touch. That was the real medicine sometimes. A firm hand on a shoulder, a calm voice saying, "Easy now, son, easy. We're gonna get you out of here." You'd say it even when you knew it wasn't true, because the look in their eyes, that was the worst part. It wasn't just pain, it was fear, a raw, animal fear. They'd look at you, and you were everything to them in that moment. You were the line between life and death. You were the face of hope. Their hands would grab yours, their grip incredibly strong, desperate, like you were a rope and they were falling off a cliff. And you'd look right back at them and you'd make that promise. "I've got you. You're gonna be okay." And you'd pray to a God you weren't sure was listening anymore, that you weren't lying. You'd see their eyes change, just a little, the terror softening into a flicker of trust. That trust was a heavier weight to carry than any pack or rifle. It was a sacred thing, and it could break you if you thought about it too much. You learned to build a wall inside yourself, a little compartment where you put all the horror, all the fear, just so your hands could stay steady and your voice could stay calm. But that wall, it couldn't hold everything. Some things just bust right through and take up permanent residence in your head. The sounds. Oh God, the sounds. The screaming I already told you about. But there's other sounds. The quiet, hiccuping sob of a big, tough farm boy calling for his mom as he bled out. The awful, final rattle in a man's throat when he let go. The thump of a shell landing too close, and the silence that followed, which was somehow worse than the explosion. And the smells. The blood, the cordite, the stale sweat of fear, the sour smell of vomit, and later, the smell you never, ever forget, the smell of death. It's a sweet, cloying, rotten smell that gets in your clothes, your hair, your skin. You could scrub yourself raw and you'd still smell it. You de-taste it in your food. For years after, a certain smell on a hot day would bring it all back. And the things you saw, no human being should ever have to see what men can do to each other with modern weapons. The sheer mess of it. It strips away any romantic notion of war, of glory. There's no glory in a field of broken bodies. And the weight of failure, that was the crusher. No matter how fast you were, no matter how much you knew, sometimes it wasn't enough. You de-work on a guy for what felt like hours, your arms aching, your back screaming, pouring all your skill, all your will into keeping him alive, and then he'd just slip away. The life would just go out of his eyes like a candle being snuffed, and the feeling that followed was a cold, hollow emptiness. You'd feel it in your gut. You close his eyes, maybe say a quick silent prayer, "I'm sorry, buddy, I'm so sorry." And then you'd have to turn away because there were always more voices calling, "Medic, medic," in that desperate, fading way. But even in that hell, you found these small, defiant acts of mercy, these little pockets of humanity. I remember one time, outside Bostonia, it was colder than anything I'd ever known. The snow was red in places. Had a guy, shrapnel had gotten him bad, and we both knew he wasn't going to make it. The shelling had started up again, getting closer, and the order was to pull back, to fall back to a safer position. I could have gone. I should have gone. But he was conscious, and he was scared, and he knew what was happening. He had a grip on my sleeve, so I just stayed. I propped myself up next to him in that frozen foxhole, put my arm around him to try and keep some warmth in him, and I just talked. I talked about stupid things. I talked about the farm back home, about my dog, Duke, about the taste of my mom's apple pie. I don't even know if he was hearing me, but I kept talking. The shells were falling, the ground shaking, and I was just sitting there, holding on to this dying kid, telling him about apple pie. He died before the shelling stopped, but he didn't die alone. In that moment, that was the only victory that mattered. Not taking a hill, not gaining a yard. It was just making sure one scared boy didn't have to face the darkness by himself. You carry all of it forward. You think you'll forget, but you don't. The faces. I remember them clearer than the faces of some of the men I served with for years. The kid from Ohio who showed me a picture of his girl right before he went back up the line, the one who died in that cellar with the stomach wound. I never even knew his name. I remember the ones I saved, too. Sometimes, in a rare, quiet moment, you'd see a guy you de-patched up weeks ago, walking around, maybe with a limp, but alive. He'd nod at you, a look passing between you that said everything. That felt good. For a minute it made sense. But the skill, these healing hands, it became a burden. After the war, I came home, and everyone wanted to forget. They wanted to talk about the heroes, the big battles. They didn't want to hear about the blood and the mud and the sounds. And I had this knowledge, this awful, intimate knowledge of how fragile a body is, how much damage a piece of metal can do. I'd be shaking a man's hand at the grocery store, and I'd unconsciously feel for his pulse. I'd look at a crowd, and my mind would automatically start triaging, thinking, that one's a bleeder, that one's a break. It was like a ghost was sitting on my shoulder, whispering reminders of the carnage. I tried to find a purpose in it all for years. Why did I see those things? Why did I have to do those things? It wasn't about patriotism in the end, not really. That's the flag-waving stuff they put in the papers. When you're in it, you're not fighting for your country. You're fighting for the guy next to you. And for me, it became even simpler than that. I found my purpose in the madness, not in the grand strategy or the victory parades, but in those moments of connection. In the simple, profound act of offering a shred of comfort to a suffering soul. A bandage, a sip of water, a kind word, a hand to hold. In the middle of all that man-made hell, that was the only thing that felt truly human. That was the only thing that felt real. And I suppose, when I'm an old man sitting on my porch and I think back on it, that's what I'll hold on to. Not the noise, not the fear, not the loss, but the quiet moments in between. The look of gratitude in a dying boy's eyes because he wasn't alone. That's the peace I found. That has to be enough. He came down the communication trench like a ghost from my past. His face so clean you could still see the tan lines from where his helmet hadn't been, his uniform a color of field gray that hadn't yet been stained by mud and sweat and fear. I was cleaning my rifle for the 10th time that day, the familiar scent of hops number 9 solvent mixing with the ever-present stink of wet earth and cordite, and I saw him being led by a lieutenant who looked almost as green. The kid's eyes. That's what got me. They had that wide, frantic look, darting everywhere, taking in the splintered trees, the sagging barbed wire, the bored, grim faces of the men who had been here through the winter. It was a look I recognized, a reflection of the man I was a lifetime ago, back in 41, all eagerness and terror swirling together into a kind of dizzy sickness. He had that Newcar smell, you know, not just the clean wool and fresh leather of his gear, but an aura of untouched luck. And in this place, that made him a magnet. The enemy snipers, they looked for the guys who didn't know how to move, and worse than that, his own damn luck seemed to have a bullseye on it. I felt two things war inside me right then, a desperate urge to grab him by the straps of his pack and tell him everything, every dirty little secret of staying alive, and at the exact same time, a hollow, weary urge to say nothing at all, to just let the front teach him its own brutal lessons because words were so damn useless. The lieutenant nodded at me. Feldwebel, this is your new man. Get him situated. And just like that, he was my problem. I didn't ask his name. I never asked their names. You learn that lesson quick, or it breaks you. But you still have to try to keep them alive, even if it's just for a few more days. So I started with the only thing that felt solid, the earth itself. I took him to a patch of ground that was relatively quiet, though quiet on the Eastern Front was a relative term, and I handed him a shovel. Dig, I said. He started hacking at the dirt, making a shallow scrape like a grave for a small dog. I let him sweat for a minute, watching the clumsiness of his movements. Then I stopped him. No, not like that. You're not planting potatoes. I took the shovel from him, my own hands feeling the familiar ache in the joints that never really went away. You dig down, deep enough so that when you stand on the firing step, your head is just below the parapet. See, you make a ledge here for your feet. That way you can fire over the top without exposing your whole body like a target at the fairground. I showed him how to angle the bottom just slightly, to channel the water away when the rains came or the snow melted. Water will kill you just as dead as a Russian bullet, I grunted, the effort of digging a familiar strain in my back. Trench foot will rot your feet off, and then you're no good to anyone, not even yourself. You check your feet every day, son. Every single day. Dry socks are worth more than a hot meal, remember that. I could see him listening, but his eyes were still on the horizon, looking for the enemy he couldn't see. Look at me, I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. He flinched and met my gaze. This hole isn't just a hole, it's your home. It's the only thing between you and oblivion. You treat it with respect. Next, I pointed to a nearby birch tree, its trunk scarred by shrapnel. See that tree? If bullets start flying and you get behind that tree, what happens? He shrugged, uncertain. It hides you, I said. It gives you concealment. But a bullet from a Marcin Nagant will go through that would like a hot knife through butter. It's concealment. Now see that pile of rocks over there, what's left of that wall? That's cover. Cover stops bullets. You learn the difference. Concealment hides you. Cover saves you. Always choose the rock over the tree if you can. I taught him the sounds, the sickening music of the front. The thump of a mortar tube firing in the distance, a sound you had to listen for because it gave you a few precious seconds to find that cover. The whistle of an incoming shell, and how the pitch told you everything you needed to know about where it was going to land. The dry, papery rustle of an artillery barrage that was miles away, a sound that was almost comforting, and the terrifying ripcloth sound of one that was coming right for your sector. The quiet is worse, though, I told him, my voice dropping. After a barrage lifts, you don't pop your head up. You wait, because that's when they come in the silence, hoping you'll be stupid. You wait, you listen, you make sure the world isn't about to end all over again. These were the easy lessons, the practical ones, the ones you could explain with your hands and a diagram drawn in the mud. The harder lessons, the ones that festered inside you, those were another matter. How do you tell a boy who still probably thought about the girl he left behind how to wall off a piece of his own heart? The mail call was the most dangerous time of the day, more dangerous than any patrol. I saw his face light up when the word came down the line. He got a letter, a thick one, and a small parcel. He vanished into that envelope like it was a basement he could hide in. I remembered that feeling, the smell of home on the paper, the looping handwriting of my mother or of someone special. It was a poison, that's what it was. A sweet, slow-acting poison. You'd read about dances and picnics and arguments over nothing, and you'd look around at the frozen mud and the rations that all tasted of cardboard, and something inside you would just break. The willingness to do what needed to be done, the animal instinct to survive, it would get softened by those memories. So I told him later, when he was folding the letter away with a sad smile. Don't live in those, I said, nodding at his breast pocket where he'd tucked the letter. Read them, cherish them, but then you put them away. That world isn't this world. Thinking about it too much will get you killed. You need to be here in this shit completely. Your mind can't be back in some cafe in Munich. He looked at me like I'd cursed his mother. But it's all we have, he said, his voice quiet, defensive. It's what we're fighting for. I just shook my head, a wave of tiredness so profound it felt like a physical weight washing over me. No, I said. Right now, you're fighting for the man next to you. You're fighting for your own life. The why is for later, if you're lucky enough to have a later. Thinking about the why now will just make you hesitate. And hesitation is a death sentence. I could see he didn't understand. How could he? I didn't understand it until I saw my first friend die, a boy named Klaus who I'd known since school, who took a piece of shrapnel in the neck at Volkov. He bled out in the mud, making a gurgling sound, and all I could do was hold his hand and watch the light go out of his eyes. After that, you build a wall. You have to. You become friends, sure, but it's a different kind of friendship. It's quieter. You don't talk about the future. You share your cigarettes. You watch each other's backs. You laugh at the dark, stupid jokes like how the only thing that grew well in this soil was the rations they gave us, because it was already shit. But you don't get too close. You can't afford to. Because when the mortar round lands in the middle of a conversation, or a sniper's bullet finds its mark during a game of scat, the pain of it will cripple you if you've let that person inside the wall. That was the true, unspoken curriculum of survival. And as the days bled into one another, a week, maybe two, I watched the lessons start to take hold on the replacement. The eagerness in his eyes was replaced by a dull vigilance. The clean uniform was now caked in the same grime as the rest of ours. He moved with more purpose. He dug his hole with a practiced efficiency. He was learning. But I knew, with a certainty that sat like a cold stone in my gut, that it wouldn't be enough. No amount of my advice, no clever trick with a foxhole, no lesson on cover versus concealment could prepare him for the random, indifferent horror that was coming. War wasn't a test of skill, it was a meat grinder. And that was the final thing I never told him, the piece of advice I kept to myself, because it was the most cruel and the most true. I never learned his name because it was easier that way. It was a little ritual, a superstition, a pathetic piece of mental armor. If I didn't know his name, if he was just the replacement, then maybe it wouldn't hurt so much when he stopped being there. It was a lie, of course. A stupid, futile lie we all told ourselves. You still saw the empty space where he used to sit. You still heard the silence where his voice should have been. The guilt found a way in regardless. It found a way in every time. The morning it happened was cold, a brittle, grey dawn. There had been probing attacks all night, and we were all strung out, our nerves shot. The order came down for a reconnaissance patrol, just a quick look-see into Narmansland. It was his turn. I remember the look he gave me as he checked his rifle, a look that was no longer that of a boy, but of a tired man. He nodded at me, a quick, sharp gesture. I nodded back. That was it. No words. What was there to say? Good luck. Come back safe. Those were curses, not blessings. I watched him go over the top with the others, their forms becoming ghosts in the morning mist. I sat back against the wall of the trench, lighting a cigarette, the smoke doing little to cut through the cold. And then the world exploded. It wasn't an aimed barrage, just a random harassing fire from the Russian lines. A dozen shells fell across the sector. Most were harmless, impacting far away. But one landed exactly where it needed to erase 3 men from the earth. The sound was different, a direct hit. I didn't need to look to know. You feel it in your bones. When the patrol stumbled back, missing 3 men, their faces blank with shock, I just closed my eyes. I never asked which one he was. I never asked for a name. I just added his face to the gallery of ghosts I carried with me, another boy who I'd tried to teach how to survive in a world that had gone mad. The last piece of advice, the one I could never voice, was the only one that mattered in the end. Survival here had nothing to do with being a good soldier. It was a blind, stupid lottery. A matter of being in a foxhole that was a foot to the left or a foot to the right. A matter of a shell landing now instead of 3 seconds from now. It was all just luck. And no amount of skill, no amount of hardened wisdom could stop a random shell with your number on it. That was the real war, not the one they put in the pamphlets. It was just waiting and hoping your luck held out for one more day.